I'm Alec Farker, moderator for this session. Disability in Work Canada is very, very excited about this particular session along with all the others. But before I get started on the content of the session, I had a little bit of background information to give people. First of all, there will be a live Q&A session after the presentations. And for that Q&A session, you can type your question in the Q&A box or the chat, and we'll be monitoring the chat and the Q&A box throughout. You may also raise your hand in Zoom, and we'll be monitoring that as well. And that will allow us to unmute you so you can ask your question. So there'll be a lot of ways for you to participate. And the accessibility is very significant for this session as for the others. We have an ASL interpreter. We have a French-English interpreter for some sessions. I don't believe for this one. Though I think, Melody, you could help out if we had a French question possibly. And we have the caption.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, so we're trying our best to make things accessible, but if something goes wrong, absolutely put a comment in the chat, in the Q&A. We'll do our very best to assist you in real time. And there's also some further information in a little bit more detail about the closed captioning in the chat right now. So with all that, I'll turn to the content of this session, and I'm pleased to announce that we have almost 70 participants, which is showing you that this is really attracting some significant interest in our conference setting. So the session is entitled, and I think it really symbolizes something really important for the conference. The first word is change with an exclamation mark. That's really important. This is not just a talk shop. We're trying to bring change. And it's a call for a non-punitive, ethical, evidence-based, and person-centered support for persons with disabilities, but specifically for substance use disorder. So the session description in detail is in the materials. I won't go into great detail, but we've got three tremendous presenters who are going to give you a survey of all the issues from the perspectives of a researcher and professional, the perspective of someone who's been affected by substance use policy, and finally by a lawyer who's represented people and has some really great ideas from both a labor and an employer perspective. So we have Charlotte Ross. She'll be the first presenter. She's a registered nurse. She's done some significant research in this area, and you're going to see some of the results in her presentation, and her full bio is in the materials. Byron Wood has taken action following a struggle that he had with these issues around substance use disorder. As a registered nurse, he founded the and is now a board member for Workers for Ethical Substance Use Policy called WESWP. And Byron's been in touch with me back and forth, and we've really had some great conversations. You're going to see a lot of the sort of personal experience, but a really good example of someone who's taken a really rough life experience and turned it in a positive, constructive direction, seeking change. And finally, Jonathan Chapnick, a lawyer, chartered human resources professional, and Jonathan has had a wide range of experience, both with employees and unions in this space and well beyond it. And when you see his bio, you're going to see someone who's obviously deeply caring and involved in many, many ways, way beyond law practice. So we've got three really good presenters. We'll have Charlotte first, Byron second, and Jonathan third. They'll probably have a little bit of an interchange among themselves afterwards, and we're going to really strive to leave time for the Q&A. And because the session ends at 3:25, we really want that Q&A to be started by around 3:05 at the latest. So I won't take any more time other than to say one thing when you're listening and or watching these presentations. These issues are about how people get stigmatized for something that is affecting them. And it's how the programs for intervention, some very well intentioned, follow through on a stigmatizing approach and also don't work very well. Although these folks are talking about substance use disorder, please think about this as it applies more broadly to disability and to the many interventions in workplaces that are intended to be supportive, but may not end up being so. So on that note, let's turn to Charlotte. And my only role from here on is sort of a little bit of timekeeping, and I'll be reminding people that we're getting close to the Q&A time. Thank you.
Thank you, Alec. And thank you everybody for attending. I'd like to also provide an acknowledgement of my gratitude for coming to you today from the unceded and traditional territories of the Kikite, Coquitlam, and Coast Salish people. So my part of this talk is I'm going to discuss the findings in my 10 minutes, and then I'm going to come around with the group, the three of us, to talk about the recommendations arising from a study that I carried out on the regulatory program in a Western Canadian province to manage nurses who have been identified as having problems with substance use. As was said, I'm a registered nurse. I'm also a registered psychiatric nurse. I've been a practicing nurse for 40 years. And this study came out of my experiences with nurses' work life and with nurses' substance use. I have not been involved personally in a regulatory program, but my participants all were. And what I did was gathered ethnographic data from interviews with 12 nurses who are in what I'm referring to as the program, which is the program to manage nurses' substance use. And I analyzed institutional documents as well. And I performed an institutional ethnography that looked at, described and mapped how the nurses' experiences were managed in the regulatory program. And the findings, I'll just go over briefly with you. So what happens is when a nurse was identified by either the workplace, the union, or the regulatory body, they were entered into what I'm referring to as the program. And it was a standardized treatment program, which was ostensibly used to protect the public. The second objective of this program was to support a nurse through a treatment program. So what I did is I looked at this treatment program that had not been researched before. It had always been accepted in the literature as best practice, although nothing had ever investigated what that practice was or the outcomes of those practice. And what I found was it was convention and tradition, not evidence. So what was that program? So what happened is the nurse was immediately assigned, and what I mean by assigned, they were told this is the person you would see, an independent medical examiner, which was an addiction physician, or we'll call that an IME. So they had a doctor assigned to them who would assess them and provide a diagnosis and a treatment program. The treatment program was always assigning 12-step activities. And this included inpatient treatment of a couple of weeks at one of 2 designated facilities, no options provided there or allowed, and ongoing attendance at 12-step community meetings. Also, they were required to have complete abstinence from all psychoactive substances except caffeine and nicotine. And this was consistent and mandated, and it did not matter what they had what substance they had a problem with, or to what degree they did, or whether it had ever affected their practice or not. And they were monitored for compliance to this abstinence requirement through routine random biological specimens. And what was required is 24/7 abstinence, not just when they were working. So at all times, even on vacation. What I saw when I examined this was I was a pronounced disjuncture between what was presented in the official documents and the official accounting and with the nurses' experiences. So forgive me for reading directly off my slide, but when it is a quote, I will do that because it's somebody's experience. So here is what the official account was on the regulatory website about this program and how it worked. So as you can see, it says Kelsey was diagnosed with substance use disorder by a medical expert. Her recovery plan included treatment, connecting with a local recovery community, and enrolling in a medical monitoring program. After treatment, Kelsey was reassessed by the medical expert. She thinks Kelsey is fit to return to work with medical monitoring and supports in the workplace. This is the presentation. So the following is an example of somebody's actual experience of that program. The way I experienced it was being forced to side with the abuser or lose my ability to practice my profession. The degree of intimidation I experienced is really difficult to quantify or explain. The nurse must subjugate herself to their version of reality. Any dissent is viewed as evidence of instability, and there is no way out except total submission. I will say that I'm healthy despite the treatment, not because of it. So I'll unpack that a little bit in my findings. What I found was the treatment, or what was identified as treatment, was based on a moralistic, outdated approach. Fundamentally, it was that of the 12-step program, where substance use problems were seen as a moral and character deficiency. And what happened is evidence-based pharmacotherapies that are considered current norms of practice were ruled out for all of my participants. Collateral information or any kind of input from nurses, personal health care professionals were ignored or disqualified. So here's another example of how ruling ideologies ruled out over evidence-based treatments. My IME told me that if I worked the steps hard enough, I could probably come off my bipolar medication. When my psychiatrist tried to advocate, she was ignored, despite knowing me for years and being a specialist in the areas of women's health and healthcare professionals with mood disorders. She was told what she could or could not prescribe for me. What I also find was treatment was organized as subordination to this regime. Dissent towards this or against this, was identified as a disorder or as non-compliance, or the words usually used was lack of engagement with the process, which impaired the nurse's ability to return to work or come out of the contract, because this treatment was organized into a contract that the nurse had to sign that usually lasted 2 to 3 years at a minimum. So a diagnosis of substance disorder was identified as a danger to the public, and the nurse was entered a mandated entry into this program. And fitness to practice ultimately meant compliance with this regime. What was really disturbing is with this whole approach, nurses were denied standards of care that they were expected to adhere to in their practices. And this was identified by several of the nurses, that they were expected to provide specific standards of care to their clients. For example, autonomous choice in their treatments, treatment in accordance with clients' religious beliefs, collaborative goal setting and collaborative treatment planning, individualized care, trauma-informed best practices, evidence-based practice, and harm reduction practice. None of these were presented to or allowed for the nurses. The nursing body also outsourced and abdicated their regulatory power to these designated IMEs. And these designated IMEs all had a particular philosophical perspective, which was 12-step and abstinence. They were designated as the experts. And there was in the regulatory body an adjudication committee called the Inquiry Committee that ultimately made all the decisions on the nurses' cases, but they deferred exclusively to the IMEs. And when I asked what qualifications those on the Inquiry Committee had, I was told by a program administrator if they had any qualifications in treatments or research about substance use problems. And the answer was, they do not necessarily have to have any specialization in substance use or addictions, but that would be helpful. Also, the treatment program was corporatized, and what happened is the required IMEs and the required inpatient treatment center were private corporations, and the public pay system was consistently bypassed. And several of the IMEs held financial interest in the private monitoring companies that the nurses were required to utilize. And there was uncontested dual relationships within this and no just mechanism for appeal. And I'm just going to finish before we move on to Byron with the comments about the potential conflicts of interest when I raised these to a program administrator in the regulatory body. And they said, yeah, so we've had discussions with some of the physicians, and they put up firewalls up between their practices, independent medical evaluators and me. What are the firewalls? Candace, you'd have to talk to one of the doctors. That's not something we can control. So a blind eye was consistently turned to these issues. I do have recommendations, but like I said, we're going to talk about that as a panel. And I will thank you now, and I will turn over to Byron.
Hello, everyone. I'm calling in from Coast Salish territory. So I want to pay respect to the Musqueam and the Squamish and the Tsleil-Waututh people, because this is their unceded land. So I'm a former registered nurse. I worked for the Vancouver Coastal Health Authority, and I was licensed by the BC College of Nurses, and I was a member of the BC Nurses Union. And several years ago, I was experiencing substance use problems. So I asked my union for help. And all my substance use was outside of the workplace. I'd never been impaired at work. I didn't have any problems in the workplace, no complaints. I was just struggling outside the workplace, and I wanted to get help. So I asked for help. And instead of being offered help, what happened was I was coerced into signing a treatment and monitoring contract with my employer and my college and my union. And because of that, I was removed from the workplace. And for the next 4 months, given absolutely no support, I was then required to undergo a $2,500 assessment with an addiction doctor. And I had no choice in who that doctor was. I knew nothing about his approach. And this doctor diagnosed me with alcohol use disorder and opioid use disorder. But despite that, he didn't offer me any medication or didn't allow any medication. So I wasn't offered methadone or Suboxone or naltrexone. And I had been previously prescribed and was taking medication for anxiety, and I was forced to stop taking that medication. And so this addiction doctor, he made treatment and monitoring recommendations, and I was told that I'd have to follow all of his recommendations in order to keep my job. And they were, as Charlotte said, total abstinence, random drug testing, and that testing could happen anytime outside of the workplace, during work hours, on vacation. And it wasn't just urine testing, it was blood testing, hair testing, liver enzyme testing, fingernail testing. I could have a breathalyzer done 4 times a day while I was at work. I could be forced to leave work during work hours, and I'd have to go to a lab to do testing. So as well as the drug testing, I had to attend a private $30,000 residential addiction treatment center. And I didn't want to go to that particular center because it was based on the religious 12 steps. And I'm an atheist, but I wasn't allowed to choose where I went. So I was forced to go to that center. I found that the methods they used there were abusive. They had some really unethical practices, such as pressuring people to discontinue opiate agonist therapy. But I went to the treatment center, I completed it, I came home, and when I came home, I had to continue with daily religious 12-step meetings. I had to attend peer accountability meetings that were run by the same addiction doctor that assessed me. I had to meet regularly with a workability officer at my work. I was forced to sign a contract with my employer and my college and my union, agreeing to follow all the recommendations that the addiction doctor made. And the contract would be in place for 2 to 3 years, but it could be extended at the discretion of the doctor. And I didn't really know what or why it could be extended. And then all of these recommendations were monitored by a private medical monitoring company who would confirm that it was following all of the recommendations that the doctor made. And I'd have to travel an hour each way by transit to go to this private company. I had to pay between $600 and $1,000 a month to them. And the company was owned by the colleague of the doctor who had assessed me. My only other option was to go to the doctor that assessed me and pay him personally to monitor me. And if I didn't follow all the recommendations, I was deemed to be non-compliant. And that would be reported back to the workability officer at my work, and I could potentially lose my job. So as a nurse, I knew that all of these things that I was being forced to do weren't rooted in science. I asked for choice, which is a part of informed consent in healthcare, but I wasn't allowed any choice. I asked for non-12-step options. That wasn't allowed. I asked for medications. That wasn't allowed. I asked to use services through the public health system. That wasn't allowed. And basically what I was told was that I had to do exactly what this doctor who assessed me said, or I could find another profession. So I asked, well, can I see another doctor and get a second medical opinion? And my union told me, sure, you can get another assessment, but you have to pay yourself, and you can only see 1 of 5 doctors that we recommend, and we'll tell you right now that he will make the same recommendations as the doctor that you saw. So I was scheduled to return to work 11 months after I reached out voluntarily to my union asking for help, and was removed from the workplace. And during that time, I had done all the drug testing. I'd gone to the treatment center. I had provided all negative drug tests. But at this point, I realized that, I was going to have to keep on doing these things for the next 3 and possibly more years. And I just wasn't willing to do that. And they weren't willing to make any changes. So I stopped, pulled out of what I felt was a discriminatory program. And as a result, I was fired and had my nursing license taken away. So as a result of that, I filed a human rights complaint against my employer. And there was a fair amount of media attention around that. And so I've been contacted by many, many workers who work in not just nursing, but a wide variety of professions. And they've told me that they've had similar experiences being subjected to these harmful substance use policies. So we've banded together. We've created a nonprofit organization, and we're calling ourselves Workers for Ethical Substance Use Policy, or WESUP. And what we're doing, our 2 main purposes are, one, to advocate for workers. So ideally, what we'd like to do is to intervene before a worker gets caught up in one of these regulatory programs. So we're working on a navigation tool with advice to workers of what they can do if they're accused of substance use, or somebody says you have to go be assessed by an addiction doctor. And this is really the work that unions should be doing, but I haven't found that many unions are advocating for workers in this way. As in my case, I was coerced by my union to enter into this program. So yes, our organization, one, advocating for workers, and then the second part is fighting for policy change. So we're trying to educate the people in the organizations that are implementing these workplace policies. So we're sharing the research of Charlotte and Jonathan and urging them to make changes, but unfortunately there's a lot of resistance to change. We're trying to get other organizations who have the power to set standards and best practices for these types of policies. We're hoping that the BC Centre on Substance Use, the Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addiction might step in there. And we're meeting with other organizations and asking them to collaborate with us in fighting for policy change. But unfortunately, it has been difficult, and it seems to be like a really uphill battle. This outdated approach is really ingrained in these workplace policies and in, I think, the mindsets of people who implement these policies. I mean, I've been working at this for 8 years, Jonathan and Charlotte longer, and we haven't seen much change at all so far. And there's also a lot of money being made off the exploitation of workers through these programs. So there's some people and organizations that have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. So with that, I will pass it on to Jonathan.
Great. Thanks, Byron. So thanks everyone for having us here. Like Byron, I'm joining you today from the location of a settler here on the unceded ancestral traditional lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I don't have the medical and scholarly expertise that Charlotte has, and I don't have the lived experience that Byron has, or his depth of knowledge and understanding of workers with substance use issues. Both Charlotte and Byron are truly plugged into the policy and action in this area at this time. I think what I'm plugged into right now are kind of the needs and concerns and interests of workplace actors like employers and managers, and supervisors. I worked for unions and employers for roughly 15 years before starting Portage Legal Services, and in my current practice, my clients are nonprofit employers and small businesses that are concerned about basic stuff like productivity and workplace safety, well-being of their employees and their clients and their customers. So in my brief comments now, I just want to provide an employer perspective, I guess, on this approach, this regime that we've been discussing. I'm going to call it the PHP approach because it has its roots in physician health programs. So I'm talking about the regime that Charlotte kind of laid out at the outset of the presentation. I'll talk a bit about what's wrong with this approach, kind of from an employer perspective, and then maybe that'll lead to a broader discussion about some alternative ways forward that the three of us and all of us here, including folks watching, can participate in. So first, from an employer perspective, what's wrong with the PHP approach? There's so many things wrong with it, as you've heard from Byron and Charlotte. I'll just talk about a few things. Number one, this approach, this system of coercive assessment, treatment, and monitoring of an employee's substance use disorder is fundamentally aimed at the wrong target. As a person who advises employers, my focus is always on the workplace issue or problem that the employer is trying to solve. So for example, I'm talking about job performance issues like missed deadlines, poor work quality. I'm talking about attendance issues, absenteeism, even talking about behavioral issues in the workplace health and safety, bullying and harassment, violence, discrimination. And we're also talking about workplace barriers that can get in the way of safe and productive employment for certain employees and give rise to the need for workplace modification or accommodation. These are the types of things that employers need to focus on to successfully manage their workplaces. But the aim of the PHP approach, the approach that Charlotte laid out, is elsewhere. It's not on a workplace problem. It's on an employee's substance use disorder. PHP interventions are meant to eradicate an employee's disability by coercing abstinence. So this is not an approach that fosters disability confident employers and inclusive workplaces. It's the exact opposite. It's an approach that says, hey, you employee with substance use disorder, employee with disability or perceived disability, you pose an inherent and extraordinary risk to workplace safety and productivity. So we're going to ask you to leave, and we're going to ask you to come back when you're clean, when you have been cleansed of your disability. So the first and fundamental flaw in this approach is that it doesn't aim to fix actual workplace problems. It aims to fix people who are perceived to be broken. It targets disabilities. The second problem with this approach is that it's not even good at hitting its own target. So, for example, at least as they relate to alcohol use disorder, the treatment modalities in the PHP approach, residential treatment, coerced AA, group lectures, do not have a particularly strong evidence base, and Charlotte touched on this. Also, for employees with opioid use disorder, the abstinence-based non-pharmacological orientation of the PHP approach may be particularly harmful. Byron touched on that. And with respect to compliance monitoring, drug testing under the PHP approach, insofar as this contingency-based monitoring is utilized as a form of healthcare, its efficacy is not well established. Now, as Charlotte touched on, proponents of the PHP approach would say that it's all about eradicating substance use and impairment in the workplace. It's about intoxication at work, withdrawal, functional deficits related to substance use in the workplace. That's what it's trying to eradicate. That's what they would say. The problem is that even if those things are a huge problem, which the research literature says, relatively speaking, they are not, the approach isn't aimed at that stuff. For the most part, workplaces that utilize the PHP approach are usually not using tools that detect stuff like intoxication or functional deficits at work. Most drug testing under the approach is done off-site, outside of work hours, or a person is taken away from the workplace. Positive tests under these regimes typically provide no information on when or how much of a substance was used, or if the employee was or ever has been impaired at work. So this approach doesn't actually detect performance impairment, intoxication in the workplace. It is not an effective way to try to manage employees who we assume are going to be coming to work intoxicated. And that brings me to the final problem that I'll mention with this approach. It's based entirely on the stigmatizing assumption that employees with substance use disorders pose an extraordinary risk of harm in the workplace. So folks who subscribe to this approach assume that intoxication and impairment and safety risk are inevitabilities for employees with substance use disorders, which is why we see in many workplaces, particularly so-called safety-sensitive workplaces, we see policies that mandate self-disclosure of substance use disorders by employees. So, for example, a case that I worked on several years ago involved a regional health authority out here in British Columbia that required most of its employees, as a condition of their employment, to tell their supervisor if they had a substance use disorder anytime in the last 6 or 7 years. Other employers don't explicitly mandate self-disclosure, but they deliberately incentivize it. There was a big Supreme Court of Canada decision in 2017 that involved a workplace substance use policy that was dubbed the no free accident rule. And under the policy, employees with substance use disorders were encouraged to self-disclose. And if they didn't self-disclose, and if they were involved in an accident that was perceived to be substance use related, they were terminated. The point is that policies that single out employees with substance use disorders and incentivize or mandate them to self-disclose, these types of policies reflect the core assumption underlying this approach, the PHP approach, which is that employees with substance use disorders pose an extraordinary risk of harm in the workplace. But this assumption is a big mistake because it is rooted in stigma. It's not rooted in science. And I'll just make 2 quick points here before I wrap up. First, if we look at the research literature, we will find no credible evidence to suggest that employee substance use is among the major and consistent causes of workplace injuries and accidents or any other adverse productivity outcome. Second, the research that looks at the relationships between substance use disorders and adverse workplace outcomes is not high quality, and there's not a lot of it. But the studies that we do have do not suggest that there's a strong or necessarily causal relationship between substance use disorders and workplace outcomes. In fact, the relationship appears to be no stronger than the relationship between outcomes in the workplace and other factors like smoking or diabetes. The point is, it's not a strong or necessarily causal relationship. And so the PHP approach is not an evidence-informed approach to workplace decision-making. It purports to target intoxication and safety risk at work, but it's not actually aimed at those targets. And it's highly intrusive, as Charlotte and Byron got into, and it's based on arbitrary assumptions and stereotypes about employees with substance use disorders. So what are the alternatives? How can we do better? Maybe I'll take a breath now and let others weigh in on where we go from here.
So I want to thank everybody on the panel. This is what I'd like to do. And maybe Byron, you could put your video on too, if you wish. I know you've got recommendations, but possibly if we give a little bit of a chance here just right now, if anyone has questions that might help direct your comments, and then we'll get right into your recommendations, because the most important thing about our conference and what we're trying to do is we're giving an alternative vision with practically grounded recommendations. So we really want to hear those, but let's see if anyone, I don't see any questions yet. I haven't checked the Q&A. See if there's anything in, there's a,
actually, there is a question for Byron to give your contact information.
That's right,
for WhatsApp.
Yeah.
And what is a PHP? John, did you want to
let's do that.
read that?
Sure. Sorry. Yeah, and sorry. PHP is a physician health program, and essentially the program, the system that that Charlotte laid out, the program system that Byron was forced to participate in, is an approach that is rooted in a PHP, physician health program, which is essentially what Charlotte described, but applied to doctors. So you'll find this approach for doctors, for nurses, and in various other sectors.
It originated with the doctor, but it's been utilized for the nurses and others.
So I don't see any more questions. It's just the two in the Q&A. And Byron, if you could provide your contact info.
Yeah, I'm just.
I don't know how you guys want to proceed. If one or the other of you would like to start with recommendations of where you think this should go.
Well, I'm just going to open up and John kind of alluded to it, is we have a special and designated program for substance use, whereas one of my questions is why? Why do the other approaches and ways of mitigating risk with employees' health, why did they not apply? Why does this have a separate, discrete one? And it goes back to John's point about stigma, I think. I don't think we need a separate one. I think we need the same kind of oversight, which is evaluating people's individual cases, individual risk factors, individual performance and impairments of performance, and care plans, treatment plans that are applicable and logical to those particular indicators. I don't know if you guys have anything to add to that point.
I think one of the main things that I see is most of the people who I have come across have never been impaired in the workplace. So they've either been somehow identified as having a substance use disorder, or they've reached out for help. So none of these people ever need to be entered into any sort of regulatory program. Like they could be just provided with confidential, voluntary ideas of where to go for support, possibly encouraged to take some time off work if they need it. So, I mean, there's ways that this regulatory program needs to be overhauled and changed, but I think the vast majority of change would come in by never forcing people into this program in the first place, because there's not a lot of need for it.
I want to make another point, and then I'm happy to go to the questions. The other point that you think Alec alluded to, as far as the whole point of this conference, is workplaces. And when nurses in particular are returning to work, never is their workplace assessed for posing risk. For example, what are the stressors in that workplace? Perhaps drove a nurse to be in such a stressful situation that they're utilizing substance to cope. The only environmental factors that are ever assessed, and these aren't even assessed, they're put back in the individual, are the nurse has specific restrictions on their schedule, on their gradual return to work, of how many night shifts and how many hours in the week they can work. And the other factor is access to substances. And sometimes the substance isn't even accessible at the workplace, like alcohol. But those are the only two items in the workplace that are ever assessed. And those are, again, redistributed back to the individual. So one of my biggest recommendations is when we're assessing return to work or mitigation of factors that would have an effect on public safety in practice, is we need to look at the stressors in those workplaces. Are they adequately staffed? Is there security? Are they running short all the time? And COVID has done nothing to help this matter. But and look at the relationships with the supervisors. So we need to really start assessing workplaces, not just individuals. I will stop now and let the questions.
So the next question is, this is actually really gets us in possibly to Jonathan and more recommendations for the future. There's first of all is a question, why are corporate or private sector medical practitioners emphasized over public ones? Maybe that's, Byron could start that one. And then we have a question probably for Jonathan. Do you have examples such as policies, collective agreement articles that unions can use as an advocacy tool for their members? So let's start with the question from Lily, which is about what Byron mentioned, that there's these corporate or private sector medical practitioners. It's a really important question.
I mean, I was sent to, so I live in BC, and I was sent to a treatment center in Ontario. And what I was told was that there are no treatment centers in BC that specialize in addiction care for healthcare professionals. And I had to go to Ontario to get this. My experience at the facility was that there was no specialized care for healthcare professionals. It was a 12-step treatment center, and the treatment for everybody was the same, other than I think a once a week peer support group for healthcare professionals, which you could access anywhere in the country. So the reason people are sent there, I'm not sure. Is there relationships between the people who are referring us there and the company? I don't know. The private medical monitoring companies is a huge money-making scheme for the addiction doctors who are referring us there. We've made complaints to the College of Physicians about this, and they've taken the stance that it's perfectly okay for them to have those business associations. So yeah, it's money, I think. The drug testing could realistically be done at a lab at no cost, like a Life Labs at no cost to the employer or employee. And then the results sent back to somebody like their general practitioner. Why that's not being done, I really don't know.
Okay, let's go to the question for mostly for Jonathan, which is about the
Sure.
collective agreement, some advice for unions.
Yeah, so the question is examples of policies, collective agreements, that articles that unions can use as an advocacy tool for their members. And I just, off the top of my head, I guess there, in most collective agreements, there's an anti-discrimination provision that mirrors the Human Rights Code and or Human Rights Act in the different province or jurisdiction. collective agreements policies might speak to personal privacy and informational privacy. So those protections could be relied on in this area. But I think even beyond, this stuff is so much more fundamental than what you'll see in a collective agreement. It's just about, Byron touched on it, basic principles around consent to medical treatment, choice in your physician, choice in informed choice and consent in relation to a treatment regime. I think, yeah, that's. I don't want to go off on a tangent here, so because we have a bunch of questions, but that's. I'll leave it there for now.
So the next one from the Q&A is from, whoops, it's being blocked by something. Let's get rid of this. There we go. I've wondered if other return to work processes require the employee to pay for treatment. For example, does someone requiring physiotherapy have to pay for that? I'm wondering if there are grounds for a discrimination complaint here via union grievance and/or human rights. We could start with Jonathan, but this is, I know Byron commented on, I was quite surprised too when I heard it.
So I think, this touches on an important point. I think kind of the onus to pay in this area is a complex question around if there is some sort of treatment or rehabilitation that needs to be paid for, whether that onus is on the employer or the employee. That's a complicated issue, but I think if we put that complicated issue aside and we just focus on this basic, I think kind of in some ways the answer to this question is most return to work processes don't mandate treatment. They mandate that you come back to work, ready to work. And they look at what limitations and restrictions you might have in your return, and they accommodate those as, if there are reasonable options for accommodation. But the focus isn't on the person's treatment. The focus is on the return to work planning for their return. And that, like I said, that looks at things like modifying the working environment, the schedule, expectations, and job responsibilities. So I think that's kind of where the disconnect is here. We're not supposed to be so preoccupied with the treatment that the employee is pursuing or participating in. As an employer, what you're supposed to be preoccupied with is how can we remove barriers in the workplace so you can do your job, and that's supposed to be the focus of a return to work program, if that helps at all.
Yes, and if I can add to that, John, I think one of the things we need to seriously look at is decoupling risk management from treatment. They're two very different things which have been conflated to the detriment of employees' human rights, as Byron is an example of there in his successful human rights complaint.
The next question.
Sorry, can I just mention quickly? So the treatment center that I was sent to, I did get that covered by government funding, and my employer was going to pay for the first year of drug testing, but after that it was my responsibility. So I've talked to people who have spent tens up to $50,000 on drug testing. One woman had to sell her house. Other people have left their professions because they can't afford to continue paying that money.
Wow. I don't think this is known to the general public at all. This is quite extraordinary stuff you're putting out here. There's one more Q&A and we'll get to the chat. This is a question. It's really highlighting nurses' working conditions. I'm watching the time. I want to make sure we get in a couple more. how do we move towards collective decolonizing approaches to health and wellness versus individualized ones? Great point about nurses' working conditions. 12-hour workdays are unreasonable, unhealthy, and safe. And I'm moved here by what you're presenting in the face of what we've seen in COVID and the extraordinary sacrifices people have made. And then they end up with a substance use problem, and this is how they're treated. It's a crazy disconnect. I just wonder if you've got a comment on that. Maybe Byron, and then maybe just you, and then we'll try to get to the chat question.
I'll say something quickly, but I know Charlotte's written a paper about this, so she's probably better suited to talk about it.
I'll put the reference in while you're talking.
Great.
Sure. So the question about individual, like seeing it as an individual problem rather than, I just think about the determinants of health. Like most health conditions, you think about what could be some of the causal factors, and some of them are your working conditions, racism, what your home life is like, what your childhood was like. But in this whole program, that's not looked at. They're never asking you, what's going on at home. A lot of the people that I've talked to, their substance use was during a very brief period in their life when they were going through something very difficult. And they got labeled, as this lifelong risk to workplace safety, where I think we need to look at, what's behind this and what in the systems and organizations that can change to help people rather than looking at the individual.
Charlotte?
Yeah, I totally agree with Byron. I think it's, as my work shows, and I put in a couple more references, is that this whole issue of, and nurses particularly, substance use has been individuated and decontextualized from their workplace. My whole work came out of when I was doing my initial lit review for my PhD. All I could think of was, have these people ever worked as a nurse? As I'm reading these article after article after article, basically pillorying nurses who have substance use problems as deficient, that they're not coping adequately, they need to be more resilient, and not looking at what the expectations are in the workplace of what they are having to face and cope with. And my work was before COVID. So, we need to start looking, as Byron said, at the social determinants of health, looking at the structural factors in nurses' workplaces or other people's work.
So we're close to the end because 3:30 is the time. I do want to make a short comment of my own. I have worked as a manager, and I've managed through situations with employees who did have substance use issues. And a supportive, personally tailored approach that valued the person and sent them a strong message. We really want you back in our work community. I've seen it work really, really well over and over. I have seen people who've struggled and perhaps it was just too big, but by and large, overall, I've seen overall positive results from that kind of approach. So I've got some personal experience from that end of it myself.
Well, I'm gratified to hear that. I just want to refer to one of the type of agreements or contracts that are used as opposed to the supportive approach that you outline there, is some of these, and John can speak to this, some of these contracts are referred to explicitly as last chance agreements. So, wow. Yeah.
And that's not uncommon. So let's, I'm just looking at the chat now. I noticed, Charlotte, you posted one thing, at least in a chat that was just to me. So I'm asking Josh if you can keep the chat open after 3:30. We've got to harvest all these. They're really good links.
Sorry.
Then there's, here's somebody commenting, employer is the BC Public Service, mandated to attend treatment. The funding formula is $8,000 split. First $3,000 a loan by the employer, then a grant, and the loan being used first. The IME recommended a private center, but then the employer ignored, telling him to look for publicly funded. So you can see this is all over the map. And this one's people have no idea. I'm not sure there's an answer to that. I'm just looking. Compassion fatigue. Compassion fatigue training and vicarious trauma training should be provided in depth to help mitigate the environmental factors in work that could influence substance use challenges. Maybe this could be your last comment, because I have a feeling we're just about out of time. We do have a short closing in the last minute of the session. So someone want to comment on that? Because that's pretty important.
I think compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma are huge contributors, but I think who needs the training is the managers. If it's just provided to the individuals, particularly nurses, then it comes back again to being more resilient and not having compassion fatigue or not being traumatized and doing yoga and meditation and dealing with it all. But I think that the managers need to be aware of these realities and mitigate the factors in the workplace that contribute.
I think on that note, we're going to close the session. I think we could also stay here. We only have networking sessions after the first set of parallel sessions, not after the second. I imagine we could stay here for, I don't even know how long. It's such a rich discussion. I want to thank Byron for taking your experience and turning it in such a fantastic, positive, impactful direction. Charlotte, and similarly, you've taken your experience and you brought it into the academic world. It's so impressive. And it shows the value of what we just said, which is the researchers understanding frontline realities. And Jonathan, you're encountering their world and you're framing it in the legal sort of system and making a difference there. So I'd like, on behalf of everyone, and there's still over 60 people here, to thank you. You've modeled what we wanted for our conference, which is frontline, but lessons that can be broadened out. And I'm hoping that everybody here, and then some, come to our final day of the conference tomorrow. It's the day when everything we've done on our steering committee with all our staff comes together, in the hope that some of you will be moved to join with us to make 2022 a very important turning point year around disability and employment, and to make an impact. So on that note, I'm going to close, but I also want to thank our ASL interpreters. I want to thank all the admin staff who are supporting the session, and we couldn't have done it without them. Josh, who's the session lead, and wish everybody a good rest of day, and hope to see you all back here tomorrow at 12:15 when we'll get going on our final day. And there's lots in there, lots of voices will be heard, and lots of change hopefully will result. Thank you.